The handcuffs were cold. The worst part wasn't that. It was that my wife didn't watch them put them on. She had already turned away. CO Eugene, CEO of Eugene Group, stood with her back to me, one hand raised to accept a cup of coffee from her assistant, Park Sulji, as two officers walked me out of the lobby of Eugene Tower. The marble floor reflected everything. The officers' shoes, the blurred faces of employees pretending not to stare, the hem of Eugene's blazer. Not a single muscle in her back shifted. That told me everything I needed to know, not about who she was, but about how long she had been that person. This wasn't a rage decision. This wasn't hurt. This was something she had filed neatly into the correct folder months ago and was only now retrieving. My name is Kong Min Jun, 34 years old, former architecture consultant, current criminal, apparently, for raising my hand at Park Sulji. Here's what actually happened. Sulji had dropped a stack of files onto our home office floor. Files I'd spent 3 weeks compiling for a project that had nothing to do with Eugene Group, nothing to do with my wife. And when I reached down to help gather them, her hand had been in the way. My palm grazed her wrist. She pulled back as it burned. 40 minutes later, she had called my wife. 2 hours after that, Eugene had called the police. I sat in the back of the car and did not argue with the officers. I did not cry. I looked at the city passing outside the window, and I made a list, not of grievances, not of names I wanted to ruin, but of every single mistake I had made that led to this seat. It was a long list. Number 1 on the list. I had married someone I admired instead of someone who knew me. Number 2, I had let admiration slowly become invisibility, and I called that peace. Number 3, I had stayed. By the time we reached the station, I had counted 11 mistakes, not 11 grievances. 11 choices that were mine. That distinction, I would come to understand later, was the only thing that saved me. The holding cell smelled like bleach and old coffee. There were 3 other men inside, 2 sleeping, 1 staring at the wall with the patience of someone who'd been here before. I sat on the bench near the door and kept my hands still on my knees. No phone call had been made yet. I had the right to one. And I was using the time before to think carefully about who I would spend that right on, not a friend. I realized, sitting there under the fluorescent light, that I didn't have friends who were mine. I had Eugene's colleagues, Eugene's social circle, Eugene's curated list of acceptable acquaintances. I had a university roommate, Choi Byung-soo, who had texted me happy birthday last year and gotten a voice note back. That was a full inventory of my independent social life. I thought about Byung-soo. He was a structural engineer now, worked with a mid-sized firm in Mapo. Good man, the kind who answered calls on the first ring. I called, "Clears, throat him." He answered on the second ring. Close enough. "Byung-soo," I said, "I need a lawyer." A pause. "Minjuna, it's 11:00 at night." "I know." Another pause. Longer. And I heard the sound of him sitting up in bed. Which station? By 2:00 in the morning. Lee Dong-hyun was at the station, not Byung-soo's usual lawyer. Byung-soo had apparently made 2 calls of his own before arriving. Lee Dong-hyun was, as I would learn, the kind of lawyer that people called when a situation had layers. He wore a charcoal 3-piece suit at 2:00 in the morning with the ease of a man for whom dishevelment was simply not a vocabulary he possessed. He sat across from me and opened a slim leather notebook. He did not offer me sympathy. He asked me 11 questions in 8 minutes, wrote everything down, and then looked up. "You'll be released by morning," he said. "The charge is minor assault, which will not hold if their only evidence is Sulji's statement and your wife's phone call. There is no physical mark, no witness who saw the actual contact." He paused. "Your wife is counting on you to be too embarrassed to contest this." I looked at him. She counted right 3 years ago. He wrote something. "And now I'd like to know everything you know about Seo Eugene's company financials." The pen stopped. Then he wrote something else. Something longer. And a small fraction of amusement appeared at the corner of his thin mouth. "I think," Lee Dong-hyun said carefully, "we're going to have a productive relationship. Mr. Kong, They released me at 6:47 in the morning. The sky over Seoul was that particular shade of gray that comes before the city commits to a color, pewter and uncertain, like an unfinished sentence. I stood outside the station with a paper bag containing my phone, my wallet, and my watch, a simple field watch. Nothing expensive, and I breathed an air that smelled like rain drains and fried food from a cart 2 blocks away. Byung-soo was leaning against a car by the curb. He had brought me a cup of vending machine coffee. He handed it to me without a word, which was the correct instinct. We stood there for a moment, me with the coffee, him with his hands in his jacket pockets. She actually called the police. He said, finally, MHM, for that? For that. Byung-soo looked at the ground. He was the type of man whose face processed emotion like weather, visible in stages. I watched him go through disbelief, then anger, then a careful settling of the jaw. Where are you going? Byung-soo asked. Good question. I did not have the answer, but I had the shape of one. The apartment was Eugene's. Her name on the lease, her furniture, her paintings that I had never liked and never said so. Going back meant performing the role of the husband who had been put in his place, which was a role I had played for 3 years without realizing the stage had been designed for exactly that purpose, not the apartment. I said, my place? No. I finished the coffee. It tasted like hot sugar and regret. Lee Dong-yun said he has an office in Yongsan. I'm going there first. Lee Dong-yun's office was on the 6th floor of an understated building in Yongsan, not flashy, which told me he did not need to advertise. The elevator was wood-paneled. The reception area had good light and no receptionist at this hour. Only a glass door still locked. I waited. At 7:30, Dong-yun arrived with a tray of coffee from a proper cafe, looked at me sitting on the hallway bench, and simply unlocked the door. Inside, one long table, bookshelves floor to ceiling, a window facing the Han River glinting silver under the lifting gray. He set a coffee in front of me and opened his notebook to yesterday's page. You asked about our financials last night, Dong-yun said, sitting across from me. Let me tell you something first. I do estate in corporate law. 6 months ago, I was approached by a firm auditing Eugene Group for a potential acquisition partnership. The due diligence came back with several anomalies. He paused, choosing the word deliberately. Anomalies in the operational spending line items, specifically in the executive discretionary accounts. I watched him, meaning what? Meaning someone has been siphoning very carefully for quite some time. The acquisition talks collapsed. My firm declined to proceed. He looked at me. I never met the CEO, but I know the signature on those accounts. The signature on those accounts was CO Eugene. I sat with that for a moment, not with surprise, more with the sensation of a piece clicking into place that had been facing the wrong direction for years. The trips she took that weren't on the company calendar. The assistant, Sulji, who seemed to have a proximity to Eugene that no assistant should have. The way Eugene's father had looked at me at their last family dinner, not with the standard disapproval of a rich man for a son-in-law of modest means, but with something almost like pity. I want everything you have. I said, every anomaly. Dong-yun smiled. It was the smile of a man who had been waiting patiently for exactly the right client. I spent 3 days at Byung-soo's apartment. His wife, a kind and practical woman named Harry, made me doenjang jjigae on the first morning and didn't ask questions, which is the highest form of grace a person can show. I slept on their couch and woke early and sat by their kitchen window with a notebook, rebuilding the architecture of my own life from scratch. Here is what I had. 12 years of architectural consulting experience, a portfolio that Eugene had once described as impressive for someone without the right connections, which I understood now was never a compliment. A modest personal savings account she had not known about because it was in my name alone, because some instinct 3 years ago had kept me from merging everything. Call it stubbornness. Call it luck. I called it the one smart thing I had done passively. 430.001. Not nothing. Not much. I called my old firm, The consulting company I had worked at before Eugene had suggested graciously and persistently that it would look complicated for her image if her husband worked for a competitor's network. I had left. Of course I had left. I had called it a mutual decision because naming it as capitulation would have required admitting what I was already losing. Director Huang answered the phone himself. Min Jun Si, he said with the particular warmth of a man who was not surprised to hear from me. I wonder when you'd call. I'd like to discuss coming back. I said, freelance first. If that works, we have a brief on a cultural complex in Incheon that 3 consultants declined because the budget was tight and the client was difficult. A pause. I saved it. I wrote Incheon in the notebook and underlined it twice. On the 3rd day, Dong Hyun called. I've arranged a meeting, he said, and did not immediately elaborate, which was his style of communicating importance. There's someone who wants to speak to you about the theology matter and about some broader context you may not have. Who? Chairman Oh Tae-sik. I knew the name. Everyone in Korean business knew the name. Oh Tae-sik was one of those figures who existed at the layer of the economy above visible, not in the news for acquisitions or charity galas, but present in every significant deal as the name behind the name. He was 67 and reportedly still ran his foundation and 3 holding companies from a house in Songbuk-dong. Why does Chairman Oh Tae-sik want to speak to me? I asked. Dong Hyun's voice carried a careful neutrality. Because, apparently, he knew your father. The pen in my hand stopped moving. My father had been an architect, not a famous one, not the kind whose name appeared on buildings or magazine covers. He was the kind of architect who made things work, who solved the problems that the celebrated architects created, who understood load-bearing logic and drainage, and the way a wall met a floor with a kind of physical affection. He had died when I was 19. I had spent 15 years keeping his drafting table in whatever space I had and never questioning why I couldn't throw it away. The meeting with Chairman O was arranged for a Saturday afternoon at a small restaurant in Songbuk-dong, the kind of place with no sign outside and reservations made by word of mouth. Dong Hyun drove. He told me in the car that he had done some additional research and that the chairman had requested this meeting through 2 intermediaries, which suggested it was not casual. What does he want? I asked. I think, Dong Hyun said, he wants to offer you something. But I also think he wants to look at you first. Inside, stone floors, low lacquered tables, the smell of pine and old cedar wood, and something slow cooking. A server led us to a private room with a paper screen on one side, through which afternoon light came in soft rectangles. Chairman Oh Tae-sik was already seated. He looked exactly like his reputation, not imposing through size, but through stillness. He sat the way very few people sit, as if the chair had been built for him specifically, and he had nowhere else to be for the rest of his life. He looked at me the moment I came through the door, not at my suit, at my face. Kong Min-yunis isi, he said. His voice was low and unhurried. You have your father's jaw. I sat down across from him. I did not know what to do with that sentence, so I did nothing with it and let it settle. You knew him, I said, for 32 years. He poured tea himself into my cup first, then Dong Hyun's, then his own. In the old way, we built something together once. A community center in Goyang that the city wanted to demolish for a parking structure. We stopped them. A flicker in those heavy eyes that might have been humor. Your father was not a man who raised his voice. He was a man who built an argument so well that the other side ran out of floor to stand on. He never told me he knew you. I said, he wouldn't. The chairman settled back slightly. He had a philosophy about influence. He thought it was most useful when it didn't know it was being used. A pause. I've watched your career from a distance, and I watched what happened to it. The way he said it, without judgment, without performance of sympathy, reached something in my chest that the night in the holding cell had not. I kept my face still. I have a proposition. Chairman O said, not charity. I want to be clear about that. I am not a sentimental man, and I did not invite you here to hand you something. He set his cup down. I have a cultural foundation project in Songbuk and Yunpyeong, a residential arts complex, community spaces, 2 small performance venues. The architect I hired resigned 6 weeks ago over a personal matter. I need someone who understands buildings the way your father understood them, not as career statements, as places people actually live in. I looked at him directly. What are the conditions? His mouth curved, not warmly exactly, but with approval, that you do the work as yourself. Not as CO Eugene's husband, not as anyone's anything. Yourself. I thought about the drafting table, the ghost marks of my father's drawings. Yes, I said, the first thing Eugene did when I didn't come home was send Sulji to check on me, which told me several things simultaneously. She didn't want to come herself. She wasn't worried enough to call the police again, and she was using Sulji as a proxy censor. Sulji appeared at building entrance on day 4, wearing concerned expression and a pastel coat, and asked the building's doorman if Mr. Kong had been seen. The doorman told her no one by that name lived there, because Byung-soo was registered under his wife's family name. I had counted on nothing so specific. It was just luck, or the same instinct that had kept my savings account separate. I was not hiding. I want to be precise about that. I was simply not announcing myself. Dong Hyun had filed a response to the assault complaint within 48 hours, citing the absence of physical evidence and 2 inconsistencies in Sulji's statement. She had initially told the office of the contact was on her left wrist, then on her right in the written statement. A small inconsistency, the kind that either happens because someone is genuinely flustered or because someone is manufacturing memory on a timeline. Dong Hyun said, if I push the inconsistency now, it gets quietly withdrawn and we get nothing. If I let it sit and file a counter complaint for false reporting, we have grounds for civil damages that will make CEO Eugene's lawyers very uncomfortable. Wait, I said. How long? Until I have something better to spend the discomfort on. He made a note. I'll draft the paperwork and hold it unsigned. On day 6, I moved into a small studio in Songbukdong. Chairman O had arranged it, not as a gift, he was careful to say, but as part of the project accommodation package, which was standard for on-site consultants, and which I could vacate at any time. The studio was on the 2nd floor of an old Hanok-style building with a single window that faced east and a floor that creaked in 3 specific places I learned to avoid. I brought nothing from the apartment. I had my phone, my notebook, my watch, and my father's drafting table, which Byung-soo had helped me collect when Eugene was at a board meeting on Thursday. I carried it up the narrow stairs myself. I set it under the east window. That night I sat at it and drew the first real sketch I had made in 2 years. Not a brief, not a client rendering, not anything required. Just a structural idea I'd had in my head for a community space where the acoustics worked for both quiet conversation and a children's choir. I drew for 4 hours without looking at the clock. When I finally stopped, the room was cold and it was past midnight, and I had covered 6 sheets of paper. Somewhere across the city, my wife was probably asleep, having assumed I would return when I was ready to be appropriately apologetic. It was the pattern of our marriage. I would offend in some invisible way. She would apply a consequence, and I would apologize until the air pressure normalized. We had done it 17 times in 3 years. I had counted. This was time 18. Except this time I had not apologized. I had drawn 6 pages of architectural sketches and was beginning to feel, for the first time in a long time, like someone who had been awake. I met John on a Wednesday morning at the project site in Songbuk. She was standing in the middle of what would eventually become the main community hall, holding a large paper bag and talking on the phone, wearing an oversized burnt orange knit sweater and wide-leg trousers and sneakers in a way that made her look like she had simply chosen to dress for a different dimension than the one I was in. She was also, I would discover, Chairman O's granddaughter and the project's cultural programming director. She finished her call, turned, and found me standing in the doorway with my drawings under my arm and said, "You look like you've been sleeping on a couch. A very good couch." I said, which was true. Byung-soo's couch was excellent. "I'm Jian," she said, and didn't add the O, which meant either she was modest or she was testing something. Programming director. "Behafend net. But grandfather told me about you." What did he say? She smiled. He said you were probably the right person for this and definitely inconvenient about it. I looked at her for a moment. That's accurate. Good, she said, and sat down cross-legged on the concrete floor and opened her bag, which contained 2 coffees and a pile of notes. Sit. Let me tell you what we need the spaces to do, and you tell me if it's structurally possible. And we argue constructively until we have a brief. We argued constructively for 3 hours. She wanted an acoustic ceiling in the main hall that would work without panels, which was architecturally annoying and technically achievable if you shaped the space correctly, like the inside of a cupped hand. She wanted a reading alcove that felt like being in a pocket. She wanted sight lines from the children's space into performance area, so small people could watch big things happening through a window. Everything she asked for was spatially unusual and emotionally precise. And by the end, I had covered 2 new pages of sketches. And she had 3 pages of her own notes with small enthusiastic annotations in the margins. How long have you been doing this? John asked when we were packing up. Consulting? 12 years? No, she said, looking at my sketches. Drawing like this, where it's obviously not the first time today. I thought about it. Since I was 20. I stopped for about 2 years. She looked at me with the unhurried directness of someone who has grown up around powerful people and so is not impressed by them, but is genuinely interested in actual humans. What happened 2 years ago? I got married. I said. She nodded, as if this explained a moderate-sized building. Eugene made her first contact at week 2. Not herself. A text from a number I didn't recognize that had clearly been drafted by someone. The sentence structure was too careful, too measured. It said, I think there's been a misunderstanding. When you're ready to talk properly, I'd like that opportunity. There was no apology in it. There was a performance of opening a door without any acknowledgement of having closed it on someone's face. I read it twice. I put my phone face down. I went back to the sketch. The text was not nothing. It was data. It told me she had expected me home by now and had not planned for the scenario. It told me Solji had not been able to locate me, and so Eugene was operating with incomplete information. It told me she had not spoken to a divorce lawyer yet, because a divorce lawyer would have told her not to make contact. She was still running the script from 3 years of our marriage where I absorbed, withdrew, and returned. What I did instead was spend 40 minutes with Dong Hyun on the phone, reviewing the divorce filing he had been quietly preparing. In Korea, divorce by mutual agreement requires both parties to sign. If she refused, or if I chose a contested divorce, it would go through family court. The grounds mattered: emotional abuse, financial deception, abandonment of marital duties. We had grounds. She'll try to reach a private settlement. Dong Hyun said she won't want the company exposed to a contested divorce. Too much visibility. I know. I said, hold the filing. For how long? Until it hurts more for her to wait than for me. The week after, the Incheon brief came through from Director Huang's firm. I worked on it concurrently with the Songbuk project from the drafting table. Porasai Ma on Tui Giying, between 6 o'clock a.m. and 9 o'clock a.m. most mornings, and then spent the day on site. My body remembered the pace of real work the way it apparently remembered everything by recognizing it immediately and organizing itself around it. Jen came to the site most days. We developed a working pattern. She talked about how a space should feel, and I talked about how it could be made to feel that way. And we argued about the specific distance between those two things, which turned out to be surprisingly close. One afternoon, as the light changed, Jen asked me, "Do you miss it? The life you had before?" I thought about it properly before answering. I missed thinking I was happy. I said, "That's different from missing the actual thing." She wrote that in her notes. I didn't ask why. Meanwhile, the world was talking. The arrest had been quiet. No press coverage. No social media moment. But Eugene's circle was not immune to gossip. And a CEO's husband being collected from the corporate lobby in handcuffs, even briefly, was a texture that spread. I learned this from Byung-soo, who had a mutual contact in Eugene's marketing department, who had mentioned casually that the CEO's husband situation was generating a third subcategory of internal opinion. Those who thought I was obviously in the wrong. Those who thought Eugene had overreacted. And a quiet third group who thought Solji was at the center of something nobody was saying out loud. The third group interested me. I asked Byung-soo to do nothing, specifically to not correct or amplify anything. Let the third group think. Let Solji's account exist unsupported and uncontested in a social space where people were already beginning to supply their own questions. And then there was the matter of Eugene's father. CEO Gwang-jin was 71, retired from the company 8 years ago, and lived in a house in Bundang with a garden he maintained himself. He and I had what I would describe as a relationship of respectful coexistence. He had not opposed a marriage, but he had watched me with the careful attention of a man storing information. We had spoken honestly exactly once, at a dinner party 3 years ago, when everyone else was in the next room, about what makes a building last. He called me on day 17. Minjun SSI, he said. He had never called me anything more familiar than that, which was fine. We both understood what formal address between us actually meant, which was that he was making no claims he didn't intend to keep. I heard about the Songbuk project. News travels. I said, oh, Tae6C is not a name people overlook. A pause. I'm glad. Not for the reason you might expect. I'm glad because you're building something. Another pause. Eugene, as he stopped, started again. She is not who I hoped she would become. That's the only thing I'll say about it. Thank you, I said, and meant it for exactly what it was. A small, precise acknowledgement from a man who owed me nothing and chose to offer something anyway. We didn't speak again for some time, but it mattered. It went on a different list from the one I had made in the police car, a list of small and unexpected things that constituted evidence that I had not misread the entire world, only a part of it. That evening, John sent a voice note. The reading alcove mock-up looks like a pocket. You were right about the curve. Don't be smug about it. I sent back. I'm not smug. I'm just accurate, she replied. That is the smuggest possible response. I put the phone down and noticed for the first time in a very long time that I was smiling at my own ceiling. Week 3, Eugene made her second in person. She knew where the Songbuk site was. Of course she did. Nothing in Seoul's business community was fully private. An Tae6 Foundation project was known. She appeared on a Tuesday morning in a car that stopped at the site entrance, and she got out alone. No Solji, which was a deliberate choice, a signal I noted, and walked toward where I was standing with the site foreman reviewing load calculations. I saw her at 30 M. I did not change my expression or my posture. I said one more thing to the foreman about the east wall reinforcement. He nodded, and then I straightened and waited. She stopped 2M from me. Her posture was perfect. It was always perfect. But I had lived with her for 3 years, and I knew her tells. The thumb pressing lightly into the knuckle of her index finger. The half-second delay before a controlled near smile appeared. She was not comfortable. You look well, she said. Site work suits me. I said, I'd like to talk. She said, properly. About what specifically? The delayed smile thinned. She was accustomed to the conversation, beginning with my apology. It had always begun there before. Without it, she had to navigate without the path she prepared. About what happened, she said. About where we are. Where we are, I said, is you filed a false assault complaint against me using your assistant as a vehicle. And I've been spending the past 3 weeks rediscovering that I have an architecture career. I said it without heat. Flat, as a description of weather. Which part of that would you like to discuss? False is a strong word. She said, finally, it's the accurate one. I said, and turned back toward the blueprint table. I'm on a deadline. If you want to discuss terms through Lee Dong-hyun, his office is in Yongsan. I'll make sure he has time for your lawyer. I could feel her standing there for 4 more seconds. 5. Then the sound of her heels on the gravel. Retreating. I kept my eyes on the blueprint. The foreman, a quiet man named Young Byung-soo, who had seen everything in 30 years of construction, said nothing for a moment, and then pointed at a line on the drawing, about the east wall. Sir, yes, I said. Let's continue. Two things happened in the fourth week that changed the geometry of everything. The first was Dong Hyun calling me on a Thursday evening with a voice that carried the particular careful neutrality of a man delivering information that is better than expected. The financial anomalies in Eugene Group, he said, are larger than I initially indicated to you. A pause. Significantly larger. And they're not limited to executive discretionary accounts. I sat down on the edge of my drafting table chair. How large? The number, if accurate, would constitute criminal level embezzlement, not a civil matter, not an internal audit correction. He paused again. The question is who it benefits. The operational spending goes out through the executive accounts, Eugene's signature, but the destination accounts are not hers. Whose accounts? I asked. That, Dong Hyun said, is what we're still tracing. But there's a name that appears as a secondary signatory on three of the routing structures. Park Solji. I sat with that for a long time. The picture that assembled itself was not a simple one, and I did not want to rush it, because rushing a picture before it was complete was how people drew the wrong conclusion and wasted their shot. What I understood so far, Solji was not a passive instrument. The assault complaint, the proximity, the access, these were not the acts of a devoted assistant. They were the acts of a partner, and not the kind I had initially assumed. The second thing happened on Friday morning. I was at the project site when Chairman O arrived. Not unusual. He came once a week. But this time he came with a man I didn't recognize. 60-something. Lean. In a suit that said government adjacent. They spoke for 15 minutes away from the rest of us. And when the unknown man left, the chairman came to find me. He stood beside me at the east wall and looked at the curved ceiling framework for a moment. He said nothing for 60 seconds, which was his way of arranging his words. There's a regulatory review being opened, the chairman said. Financial irregularities in a mid-sized corporate group. I am not involved in it. I mention it only because the timing of things is sometimes relevant information. Understood. I said, I did not engineer this. He said, and looked at me. I want you to know that. I don't operate that way. I know. I said, and I did know. You didn't have to. I think some things are self-completing. He looked at the ceiling structure again and then said, the acoustic curve on the main hall is very good. Thank you. I said, it was a disputed point. Was it one? Eventually. I said. He nodded once as if I had confirmed something about the project, and also about something larger. Then he went to speak with the site foreman, and I went back to the east wall calculations. And neither of us said anything further about regulatory reviews or timing or the nature of self-completing things. The news broke on a Tuesday, not the front page. Not yet. But a financial industry publication that people inside certain circles read religiously ran a 2-paragraph item about a regulatory inquiry into the operational accounts of a mid-sized Seoul corporate group. The company was not named, but in Seoul's financial community. A 2-paragraph item in that particular publication was the equivalent of a fire alarm in a building people had been pretending not to smell smoke in for months. Byung-soo forwarded me the article at 8:47 a.m. with a single message. Is this what I think it is? I replied, probably, at 9:15. Dong Hyun called. Her lawyers called my office this morning, he said. And even through the phone, I could hear the particular note in his voice of a man not allowing himself to be obviously pleased. They'd like to discuss settlement. How quickly did they call? Before markets opened. Tell them we'll discuss it. I said, after I file the counter complaint for the false assault reporting. A beat. That will make them uncomfortable. Yes, I said, that's the order of things. I wanted to be clear about my own intentions because clarity of intention is the only thing that keeps strategy from becoming cruel, so I did not want to destroy Eugene. I did not want to humiliate her or ruin her professionally or cause her the kind of damage that required spectators. What I wanted was specific and finite. I wanted out. Cleanly. I wanted what was mine. I wanted the assault record expunged. And I wanted her to understand, with full information, what she had done and what she had lost, not for her suffering, but because I would not accept a version of this ending in which she remained confused about her own role in it. The counter-complaint was filed that afternoon. Dong-hyun signed off on the paperwork with the unhurried precision of someone who had been waiting patiently to do exactly this. I sat across from him in his Yongsan office while he worked, and he handed me each page to review before signing. And the Han River outside was silver and entirely indifferent and very beautiful. There will be pressure from her side to withdraw this quickly. Dong-hyun said when we were done, they'll offer an increased settlement figure. Let them think about it overnight. I said, and the regulatory inquiry. If that proceeds, her lawyers will be occupied with something significantly larger than your divorce proceedings. Then they'll be occupied with both simultaneously. I said, Dong-hyun made a note. Then he looked up. I want to say something as your lawyer. Yes? You have more leverage than anyone in this situation realizes. You have the financial irregularity documents, the counter-complaint, and OTSXS implicit institutional weight behind this project. Any of these alone would be significant. Together he paused. I want to be sure you understand, you don't have to be reasonable. I looked at him. I know. I said, I'm choosing to be. He wrote that down. 2. CEO Eugene agreed to a settlement meeting on the following Thursday. Neutral ground. A private room at a hotel in Central Seoul midday. She came with 2 lawyers and a stillness that I recognized as the particular composure of someone who has had a very difficult week and has compressed it all below the surface through sheer structural will. I came with Dong-hyun and with 4 years of being invisible, which it turned out was actually 4 years of watching. The first 20 minutes were procedural. Lawyers talking about assets and joint filings and the assault complaint withdrawal, which her side wanted buried quietly, and which I was prepared to allow under specific conditions. I let Dong-hyun carry the technical weight of it. I watched Eugene. She looked at me twice in those 20 minutes. The first time assessing familiar. The look she used to give me across dinner tables when deciding whether I was a potential complication or a managed variable. The second time was different. It happened when Dong-hyun placed a financial irregularity summary document on the table. Her eyes moved to it and then to me, and for the first time in 3 years, I saw something in CO Eugene's face that was not controlled. She looked at me. How long have you known? Not a question, a statement, and an acknowledgement. Long enough. I said, I'm not using it as leverage for the divorce terms. I want you to know that. The regulatory inquiry proceeds independently of what we agree here today. It's not mine to stop. Something passed across her face that I had never seen before. And I want to be precise about what it was because it was not remorse and it was not fear. Exactly. It was recognition. The specific expression of a person who has just understood that someone they dismissed was capable of something they couldn't replicate. Restraint as strength, not as weakness. The terms I want, I said, are straightforward. The apartment, which is hers. I don't want it. 12% of the joint asset pool, which is legally mine and not a cent more. Full expungement of the assault record. A signed statement from Park Seo-ju confirming the incident was mischaracterized, which your lawyers can draft however they like as long as the substance is accurate. And a clean divorce record. Undisputed. Eugene's lead lawyer started to speak. She raised one hand quietly and he stopped. Those terms, she said, are less than you could ask for. I know, I said. They're what I want. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, to no one in particular. Draft it. Her lead lawyer made a note. Dong-hyun made a note. The room settled into the quiet procedural business of formalizing an ending. I looked at the table's surface and thought about my father's drafting table, waiting for me in the studio, in Songbuk, covered in 6 weeks of real work. I thought about the acoustic ceiling of the main hall, the curve of it, the way it would hold sound without absorbing it. I thought about Jian's annotation in the margin of her notes that said, this man draws like he's having a conversation with the building. I did not think about CO Eugene. The settlement was signed on a Friday. It took 11 days from the initial meeting. 11 days of lawyers exchanging language about language, of small adjustments to small clauses, of Dong-hyun calling me at odd hours to ask if I wanted to push on a specific point. and me usually saying no, and him sometimes saying, "Are you certain?" in a way that many thought I should push, and me saying, "Yes, I'm certain," and him writing it down. On the day the documents were finalized, Dong Yun and I had dinner at a small restaurant near his office. He ordered galbi. He poured 2 glasses of soju and pushed one toward me without ceremony. "You know," he said, "in 15 years of practice, I have never had a client who consistently asked for less than they were entitled to. I asked for what I needed." I said, "That's not the same as less." He drank his soju. No, he agreed. "It isn't." The assault record was expunged 10 days later. Dong Yun handled the paperwork with the same unhurried precision. He applied everything and called me on a Tuesday morning, confirmed it was done, and then said, "Anything else?" in the tone of a man who had genuinely enjoyed this particular case and was in no hurry to close the file. The Incheon brief. I said, "If I need a corporate structure for freelance consulting, proper entity registration, I'll send you the forms by Thursday." I registered a sole consulting practice the following week under my own name, Kong Min Jun Architecture. Not an agency, not a firm, just a name on the door, which turned out to feel like an extraordinary amount of space. Park Sil-ji's role in the financial irregularities at Eugene Group became a matter of formal investigation 8 days after our divorce was finalized. The story that emerged gradually through the financial press, through regulatory filings, was more complicated than I had initially construed it. Sil-ji had not been a passive beneficiary. She had been an active architect of a quiet and sustained embezzlement, using Eugene's access and her own position as a trusted intermediary to route funds through a lattice of minor accounts over 3 years. Eugene's signature had been used. The question of knowingly was one for courts. I did not follow the proceedings closely. It was not my story to adjudicate. What I understand now looking back, Eugene had married me partly because I was uncomplicated. No powerful family, no competing ambitions, no dangerous network. I was someone who would make the margins of her life livable without threatening the center. That calculation was not malicious exactly. It was just deeply wrong about what people are and what they quietly become when they are quietly diminished. She had not counted on the fact that a man with a good drafting table and 12 years of structural thinking left alone with his own life for 6 weeks would turn out to be harder to finish than she estimated. The Seongbuk Arts Complex opened on a Sunday in early spring. I had been on site the night before until 11:00, doing the final walkthrough. Every space I had argued for was there. The main hall with its acoustic ceiling, the curve holding sound the way a cupped hand holds water, the reading alcove that felt like being in a pocket, the children's viewing window into performance area size at exactly the right height, so that a 7-year-old standing on tiptoe could see the stage clearly. The drainage was perfect. The east wall was solid. The sight lines worked. I walked through alone at 10:30 the night before after the last worker had gone. I walked from the entrance to the main hall, through performance corridor past the reading alcove. I stopped there, through the children's space to the window in the wall that looked out over the small courtyard. The courtyard had a single ginkgo tree at its center that had been there before the building was built around it. I had designed the courtyard around the tree rather than removing it, which the initial brief had not required and the budget had not anticipated, and which I had simply done because my father's notes in the margins of an old project I had found in his things had said, "When in doubt, build around what's already alive." The opening day was a clear sky Sunday early spring. Chairman O arrived first with a small group from the foundation. Jean arrived 15 minutes later with 3 of the community arts organizations who would be using the space and immediately began introducing them to their future rooms with the proprietary delight of someone who had been waiting for this day for a year. I stood near the entrance and watched the building receive its first people, which is a thing I had always believed in, that buildings do not truly exist until people move through them. And the moment of first occupation is the moment the architecture becomes real. Chairman O came to stand beside me at a certain point in the morning in the way that had become familiar, not needing to be introduced, not requiring preamble. We stood and watched children run through the main hall. their voices bouncing off the acoustic ceiling in exactly the way the curved geometry predicted. Your father would have been pleased. He said, I hope so. I said, and then, I think he would have asked about the drainage. The chairman laughed. It was a real laugh, not the polished social variety, but the laugh of a man genuinely surprised by something that delights him. I had not heard it before. It made him look, briefly, like a much younger person. Later, Jen found me in the reading alcove. She did not say anything immediately. She sat in the curve of the alcove, which was exactly the right shape for one person, and would accommodate two if they didn't mind being close, and looked at the way the light fell through the small high window above. I sat on the other end of the curve. We were close enough that our shoulders were almost touching. It feels like a pocket, she said. Yes, I said. You were right. I know. Don't be smug about it. 2 months after the opening, the Incheon brief was delivered. Director Huang held a small review session. Me, 2 structural engineers from his firm, and the client, a community arts coalition from Incheon, whose spokesperson was a woman of 62, who looked at my drawings the way my father used to look at his, following the lines, understanding the intentions, nodding not at the aesthetics, but at the logic of care embedded in the decisions. After the session, she held one drawing up to the window light and said, this is a kind of architecture that knows what a room is for. I received the commission 2 weeks later. Full scope, design, supervision, delivery. The budget was tight, and the client was demanding in the way of people who care very much about the thing being built, which is my preferred kind of difficult. I worked on it from the studio in Songbuck at my father's drafting table every morning before going to whatever site needed me. I had, without planning it, become busy in the specific way of a person who has stopped rationing their own competence. Kong Min Jun Architecture, 8 months old, had 3 active commissions and a 4th in discussion. The regulatory proceedings involving Eugene Group concluded their initial phase around the same time. Solji was formally charged. Eugene was found to have signed documents without full knowledge of their routing destination. The legal language was careful. Whether that careful language reflected the truth or a negotiated version of it was, again, not my story to adjudicate. I noted it, filed it, moved on. Byung-soo and Harry had me over for dinner on a Friday in June. We ate dak galbi, and Harry made too much of it, which was the point, and we stayed late talking about nothing consequential, which is the most valuable kind of talking. At the end of the evening, Byung-soo walked me to the building entrance and said, you look like yourself. As opposed to what? I asked. He thought about it. As opposed to the version of you I hadn't seen in a while. I walked home from the subway station. It was a mild June night, and the streets in Songbuck were quiet and slightly fragrant with the ginkgo trees that lined the road closest to the arts complex. I walked slowly because there was no reason to walk quickly. I had nowhere to be but where I was going. I had a drafting table and 3 commissions and a friend who had saved my firm's registration paperwork with the quiet efficiency of someone who believed in it before I did. The apartment was dark when I arrived. I turned on the lamp by the drafting table. The east window showed the city, small and glittering. I put the kettle on. I sat at the table with my tea and thought, this is the question I had been answering all along without knowing someone had asked it. Not can you survive being discarded? Not can you revenge yourself on someone who wronged you? Those are not interesting questions. The interesting question, the one I had been answering through every sketch, every commission, every morning at the table before the city woke up, was simply, do you know who you are when the person who decided your value is no longer in the room? The answer, it turned out, was yes. I always had. There's a postscript to the story of Park Seul-gi that I learned later, and that I include here because it completes a picture I had been looking at from one angle. Chaein told me she had a network that operated below the visible surface of Seoul's business world the way her grandfathers did, through the accumulated goodwill of genuinely decent people. That Seul-gi had not begun as a schemer. She had begun as what she appeared, a 24-year-old from a modest background who was very good at her job and very good at reading what people wanted from her. She had been that person for a year, And then she had identified the specific texture of Eugene's blind spot, the absolute certainty of Eugene's own judgment, and made a decision. I am not interested in excusing her, but I am interested in accuracy. And the accurate version of the story is not villain, uses innocent woman, but something more uncomfortable. Two people who had each decided that the end they wanted justified the particular means they had at hand. One of them had a husband. One of them had a signature. Both of them had decided that another person's cost was an acceptable price. The difference between me and either of them, and I say this not to be noble, but because it is simply the thing I understand, is that I was not willing to make that calculation, not because I am good, necessarily, but because I have thought about load-bearing walls long enough to know that when you remove a thing you think is unnecessary, it is sometimes the thing the whole structure was built on. Jan met me at the complex courtyard on a morning in late June, as she sometimes did, to review the programming schedule for the second half of the year. We sat on the low stone bench near the ginkgo tree with her notes and my coffee, and the kind of comfortable quiet that develops between people who have spent enough time in a building together to know its rhythms. Grandfather wants to know if you'll consider the Yunpyong extension, she said, without preamble. I'll look at the brief. I said, he said you'd say that. He knows me reasonably well. She looked at me for a moment, and there was something in the look that was not the usual frank professional assessment. It was a look she had given me in the reading alcove on opening day, when the light came through the small high window, and neither of us said anything for a while. I told my grandfather you were good at this, she said. At architecture? At people, she said. The way you design for them, not for their ideal selves, for the way they actually are, the clumsy ones, the small ones who want to see big things. I looked at the ginkgo tree for a moment. I had a good teacher. I said, he never told me about it directly, but he left good notes. She nodded and did not push it because she had the intelligence to know when a thing had been said completely. We worked on the schedule for an hour, in the good way, arguing, refining, reaching something better than either of us had started with. At the end, she packed her notes and stood, and then paused with particular quality of someone who has decided to say one more thing. I like working with you, she said. It was a simple sentence. It was not a small one. I like working with you. Too, I said. She left. I stayed on the bench for a while longer with my coffee and the sound of the building behind me doing what buildings are supposed to do, holding the people inside, keeping out what should be kept out, making the space between four walls feel, against all structural logic, like belonging. This is the last chapter, and I want to be honest about what kind of ending it is. It is not a triumphant one, because triumph suggests a contest with a clear winner, and I no longer think in those terms. It is not a peaceful one, in the sense of everything resolved and everyone accounted for. It is something more specific. It is a true one. Here is what is true. CEO Eugene runs a smaller company now under restructured governance and with compliance officer who reports to the board rather than to her. She is, by most accounts of people who still move in those circles, more careful than she used to be. Whether she is better in the sense that matters, I do not know and have stopped speculating. Here is what is also true. Chairman Otasic attended the Yunpyong Extension Planning meeting in August and said nothing for 40 minutes while I presented the initial concepts, and at the end said, the courtyard plan, it's like the songbook one. And I said, yes. He said, keep doing that. And I said, I intended to. He is 67 and still runs his foundation from a house in Songbukdong. He calls me once a week to ask how the Yunpyong work is progressing, and occasionally, at the end of the call, mentions something my father once said, briefly and without ceremony, the way you pass a person something they left behind. Here is what is most true. I live in the studio in Songbukdong. The drafting table is under the east window. The floor still creaks in 3 specific places, and I still know them, and still sometimes step on them deliberately, because I've decided that the creak of a known floor is the specific sound of a place that is yours. Jen and I lack the word that is both precise and not overstated. We are in the early stages of something that neither of us is rushing because we have both spent time around buildings. And we know that the structures worth keeping are the ones that were allowed to settle before they were loaded. What I know about myself now, the thing I have earned the right to know, is this. I was never the person she thought I was. I was never the man who could be domesticated by dismissal, or diminished by a held cell, or finished by a turn back. I was the man with the drafting table and the list of 11 mistakes, and the stubborn architectural conviction that you build around what is already alive. My father knew it. Chairman O suspected it. Jen sees it every time she writes. You are just accurate, in the margin of something important. And I, in this studio, in this morning, in this specific longitude of a life that is entirely mine, know it. 2. The kettle starts. I turn from the window. I begin,